Welcome. It is Mitch. I'm on YouTube. If you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel as we try to build this thing up. This is not clickbait. This is not some alternate universe where crazy ideas are spewed. I've been pondering doing a video on this for like over a week now, maybe a little longer than that. Basically, when the reports started surfacing that the Jets and Aaron Rodgers are going to part ways this offseason, Rodgers, it seems like by all accounts, still wants to play at age 41. I think there will be minimal opportunities elsewhere. I don't think there's going to be like 7 or 8 potential destinations, and it's not a Rodgers thing. It's teams that have their starting quarterback locked in, and there's just many of those. And then you have to factor in that Rodgers doesn't want to go to a rebuild at age 41. He doesn't want to go to a situation that's a dumpster fire. And so process of elimination, you start to narrow it down. The point of this video, I am here to tell you I do believe Aaron Rodgers to Minnesota makes sense. I'm not going to tell you it's going to happen. I'm not going to tell you there's a large likelihood of it. At its core, it makes sense for Rodgers, and it makes sense for the Vikings. Jared Allen actually recently said on the Up and Adams show, said directly he would take Rodgers over Sam Darnold in Minnesota. Darnold, of course, a free agent. They drafted J.J. McCarthy in the first round last year. He had a knee injury, was out for the year, had a setback, a second surgery done in November. We'll get to that in a few minutes. I think what's so bizarre about this is, for Packer fans, you've seen it before with Brett Favre. Packers to Jets to Vikings. And for many Packer fans, it was devastating seeing Brett Favre go to Minnesota and come pretty damn close to at least appearing in a Super Bowl. Of course, they lost that NFC championship to the New Orleans Saints. I can't even remember what year it was, but in Favre's best year with the Vikings. And that was, mortifying for many Packer fans to see Favre in the purple and white, to see him play for an NFC North rival. And so I think naturally, when the Rodgers-Packers marriage ended and he was traded to New York, there were jokes that, this, of course, is going to end with Rodgers in Minnesota, a la what we saw with Brett Favre's career, going Green Bay to the New York Jets to the Minnesota Vikings. And now that the picture is coming into focus, it's at least an option that has to, I think, be weighed by Minnesota with where they're at. Like, the Vikings are a contender whether you like it or not. I hate saying it. I don't want to say it, but they're a contender. They're coming off a 14-3 season. And let's say you're in the camp that says, hey, Sam Darnold's really not that good, and his true colors showed in the regular season finale in a dud against Detroit, and then in the one-and-done playoff exit game against the Los Angeles Rams. Like, let's say your premise is built around, the Vikings overachieved this year, Sam Darnold's not that good. Well, if you think Sam Darnold's not that good and they still went 14-3, it's probably a team and a roster and a franchise and an organization that feels it might just be a quarterback away. It could just be an Aaron Rodgers away. They're coming off a 14-win season. Their defensive coordinator, Brian Flores, is back. Interviewed for a couple head coaching gigs, didn't get him. I think Minnesota's elated to have Flores back. I think everyone else in the NFC North is pissed off that they have to deal with Brian Flores' scheme, because he really does get the most out of what he has to work with. If you look at that Vikings defense, they don't have a Myles Garrett, a TJ Watt, a Fred Warner, a Patrick Surtain, yet they're really damn good. They're aggressive. His scheme messes with opposing quarterbacks and what they see pre-snap compared to what's actually coming. And Brian Flores has flourished in 2 years as the defensive coordinator in Minnesota, so he's back. And keep in mind, Kevin O'Connell just got a fresh extension already done with the Vikings earlier this offseason, so he has more job security. I don't think he needed the reassurance. Like, mentally, he had to have known it was coming based off the successes he's had in large part since taking over as the head coach with the Vikings. But you look at where this team's at, and the head coach just got a contract extension. Justin Jefferson's locked up for the long run. It's a good offensive line, pretty damn good when they have Darrisaw in the picture. Of course, they had a trade for Cam Robinson when Darrisaw went out of the frame, and it's a defense that Brian Flores has full control of, and again has gotten the most out of those guys on the defensive side of the ball. It's a contender in Minnesota, and I know Packer fans don't want to hear that. the roster has a lot of win-now ready players. Rodgers, to me, again, he's not going to have many options, and it's not necessarily a Rodgers thing. It's just the nature of the beast with where a lot of these other franchises are at. I think you could look at Pittsburgh potentially as an option. Rodgers has mentioned, even when he was playing for the Packers, but it seemed like it was coming to an end in that final year. When he was on the Pat McAfee show, again, this is a couple years ago, he had mentioned how much he respects and loves Mike Tomlin. Steelers, I doubt, bring Russell Wilson back. If they bring Justin Fields back, it's not to just hand him over the starting quarterback gig. So I think Pittsburgh could be an option. Tennessee as the number one pick, you would believe if they stay put, they're going to take a quarterback. Plus, there's a lot of other missing links on that roster. There's just not that many. Like the Raiders, does he want to go to the Raiders and play for Pete Carroll in a roster that's more than just a quarterback away? Like when I look at the Vikings, I'm like, again, hate saying it if you're a Packers fan, but the Vikings might just be an Aaron Rodgers away from, I don't want to say it, so I'm not going to say it, but from, the Vikings could be that close. Because like when I watched Sam Darnold in his 2024 season, and I thought he was incredible for most of it. And a lot of that is a credit to Kevin O'Connell. A lot of it's the system. A lot of it's the players they have in place. This isn't to take away from Darnold. I believe there's a ton of quarterbacks who have been mediocre at one stop that could come to the Vikings with Justin Jefferson, Jordan Addison, Aaron Jones, that offensive line, TJ Hawkinson, Kevin O'Connell on the ones and twos, and have success. I don't think everyone could. And so Sam Darnold certainly had to play his ass off and had to step up to the plate and did so most of the regular season. But you can't ignore and sweep under the rug what it looked like for Sam Darnold in those last two games. Some of the blame goes on the offensive line. The offensive line for Minnesota, it was not good against Detroit. It was not good against the Los Angeles Rams in the wild card round. But Darnold was atrocious as well. I think if you're a Packers fan, like, don't you want the Vikings to re-sign Darnold to like a 3 or 4 year extension? It seems unrealistic because it used a first-round pick on J.J. McCarthy. And at some point, you're going to want to hand the keys of the car over to McCarthy. But maybe there's a part of the Vikings that look at this and say, we were 14-3, and a large part of that was because of the successes Sam Darnold had. So let's bring him back. Run it back with Darnold. I don't think that's likely, but if you're a Packers fan, wouldn't you rather see them run it back with Sam Darnold? Like, he was good. They beat the Packers twice. Darnold was pretty damn good in the game against Green Bay at Lambeau Field and was all right in the win for the Vikings at US Bank Stadium later on in the season against Green Bay as well. But he doesn't exactly, strike a whole lot of fear into you. I said in many videos throughout the season when I was doing NFC North talk, like, Darnold's good. The Vikings are a great spot to be in right now. Again, I'll wash my mouth out with soap later. I did not see, and I said this repeatedly, you can go watch the old videos, I did not see any situation where Sam Darnold could elevate to the point where he was a Super Bowl winning quarterback. Because I think the Nick Foles situation that we saw in Philadelphia years ago in a Super Bowl they won in Minneapolis over the New England Patriots was an outlier situation. I didn't think Sam Darnold could elevate to a point that is required for a starting quarterback at a bare minimum to win a Super Bowl. And so I think if you're a Packers fan, you would prefer Darnold back. I'm not overly high on J.J. McCarthy. I'm just not. Again, I think that system with that coach and that talent on offense will help immensely. But I was not a huge J.J. McCarthy guy coming out of Michigan. If you go back and you watch many of those games, and maybe it was just a Harbaugh thing and what he wanted to do schematically, but in the biggest games for Michigan in that national title run, they did not rely on J.J. McCarthy. It was the defense. It was the ground game. There was a game against Penn State where J.J. McCarthy, at the time of that championship season, it was the biggest game of the year. I believe he attempted 9 passes in totality in that game against the Nittany Lions. And then I should look it up. We'll skip it for now. But the national championship win for Michigan against Washington, I don't think he didn't have 20 pass attempts. I don't remember exactly what the number was, but it was closer to 15. And so Michigan, and it sucks because maybe it shouldn't be a knock on McCarthy, but the Wolverines, they didn't rely on him to carry a large weight or a lot of the burden for that national title team. At times, it was almost like he was along for the ride. There weren't too many moments in crunch time, in big spots, where when you take a quarterback in the first round, you can point back to some tape in college and be like, look at this freaking throw. Look at this damn decision. This is incredible. This is why you circle it. It's a first-round prospect. There wasn't a lot of that, in my opinion, with J.J. McCarthy, so I'm not overly high on him. But I do think the doomsday scenario for Packers fans, and really if you look around the landscape of the NFC North, you could lump in the Lions and the Bears. Of course, this is a Packers channel. Mitch M on YouTube. Please subscribe if you haven't already. The doomsday scenario is if Rodgers ends up in Minnesota. And I know a lot of you are going to roll your eyes and you're going to think it's clickbait. I promise you it's not. Again, at a minimum, you can at least admit it makes sense for where the Vikings are at, where their timeline is, and where Aaron Rodgers is at in his career. There's a match. Pittsburgh keeps getting to the playoffs. Always has a winning record under Mike Tomlin. Haven't really done shit since the Ben Roethlisberger era, though. They'll get to the playoffs. They don't do anything once they get there. And so you sit back and you say, well, Rodgers at age 41, are you saying Pittsburgh then is going to get over the hump if they get Rodgers and get past a Lamar Jackson, a Josh Allen, a Patrick Mahomes in the AFC? No, but you have a much better chance of doing so with Rodgers than you did with Justin Fields and Russell Wilson, right? Than you did with Kenny Pickett. That's where I'm at with the Vikings. Does a Rodgers addition to Minnesota immediately make them a favorite in the NFC? Honestly, not ahead of Philly, but do they scoot ahead of Detroit? Maybe. I mean, it just puts them right there. It's a team that was 14-3, showed last year, and you can think some of it was fluky and that they overachieved. That's fine. If you remember a couple years ago, 3 years ago now, the Vikings had that season where they won all of their one-score games in the regular season, and it was like, how is this sustainable? Literally, no team in NFL history had as many one-score, one-possession wins in a regular season as the Vikings did 3 seasons ago. And then they went to the postseason in round 1 at home, lost to Daniel Jones and the New York Giants, right? And so you can say some of what happened this year in a 14-win season seemed not sustainable for the Vikings, but you can't sit back and say, oh, it should have been a 7-10 season or an 8-9 campaign. Like, no, it's a playoff team with playoff-ready players that might just need one final push. And if you just look at this objectively, if you can take the biased goggles off, it makes sense. Rodgers to the Vikings would make sense. Again, it's just the career path of Brett Favre, the rivalry between the Packers and Vikings that makes this sound to many like somewhat of a joke. And Rodgers, is anyone saying right now, you're not talking 2, 3, 4, you're not talking 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years down the road, and who knows where Sam Darnold's at, obviously in his career, 3, 4, 5 years down the road. But right now for 2025, and let's just say 2026, who's saying that Aaron Rodgers is not an upgrade from Sam Darnold? I don't. I'd listen to the case. I'd listen to that side. I'm always open to hearing the other side of the coin. I don't think I'd be as receptive to it because if you look at the Jets, you can sit back and just look at the record and say, wow, they were terrible. And they were. The Jets had an awful season. They fired Robert Saleh. It didn't work out with Nathaniel Hackett. Did you watch the games? Did you watch the second half of the season? Because Aaron Rodgers was fine. Aaron Rodgers was good. Aaron Rodgers finished, I think it was it 8th in passing yards and 6th or 7th in touchdown passes? And that's not the be-all, end-all. But he showed, even amongst a team that was not good, a roster that kind of crumbled, he can still get the job done. Now, it helped having Garrett Wilson. It helped trading for Devontae Adams. That'll help any quarterback out. But you look at some of the throws Aaron Rodgers made down the stretch those last 3-4 weeks. Aaron Rodgers, I think if you want to talk about Aaron Rodgers appearing on the Pat McAfee show and being a distraction and some of the things he says, and you can say that can be, quote, a problem, I'll hear it out. But Aaron Rodgers on the field on Sunday when the shoulder pads and the helmet was on, and I don't know how much control he had of what was being called in the offense, and that's a whole other issue. But Aaron Rodgers, just his play, it's still there, even though he's 41 years old. Like, Aaron Rodgers had a good 2024 season. I mentioned, they have McCarthy waiting in the wings, but he's coming off a gruesome knee injury that required surgery, a setback in November that required a second surgery. Minnesota, again, it could leave a sour taste in the mouths of Green Bay fans. Minnesota could take a play out of Green Bay's playbook. Have the veteran quarterback come in. Let the rookie wait a little bit, like Rodgers did with Favre in place, like Love did with Rodgers in place. Let the rookie wait, learn, observe, take over the keys a couple years down the road. All indicators are that J.J. McCarthy will be ready for the 2025 season. Again, I'm not high on him. That doesn't mean the Vikings have to just throw him right into the ring if an opportunity like Aaron Rodgers presents itself. I believe, I'm not going to say anything, I believe it makes a lot of sense. Again, will it happen? I think a lot of things would have to fall into place. But you just heard Jared Allen, former Vikings, Chiefs legend, Hall of Famer, said he would take Aaron Rodgers over Sam Darnold in Minnesota. And Darnold was just there. Rodgers isn't. So that's not, it's not like shocking to hear someone say that, but when Darnold just played for the Vikings, Rodgers hasn't taken a snap for him, and a lot of dominoes have to fall in place for that to happen. It's eye-opening to hear a former Vikings great say that. So, I think Packer fans, and you can, again, in the comments, you can tell me if I'm right or wrong, Rodgers going to Minnesota would sting. It's not knowing. It's if the real bad happens. If we saw Rodgers hoist up a Lombardi Trophy in a win over Pittsburgh back in the 2010 campaign. That's the nightmare scenario, is if it got to that point. Because if Rodgers signs with the Vikings, there might be Packer fans who scoff at it and say, the guy's 41, they tried it with Favre, it didn't work. I'm telling you, if it came to fruition and the Vikings won the division, had a wild card spot, won a game in the playoffs, and we're in a divisional round game, you're going to start sweating it out as a Packers fan, because if he was able to take them to the mountaintop, you don't ever forget that, live that down as a fan. You couldn't. And so it would be the unthinkable happening. The weird part of this is I was in high school, but if I remember correctly, when Favre went to the Vikings, most Vikings fans were all for it. I'm not sure that would be the case with Rodgers. They're really setting a culture in place there with KOC. And Rodgers he has the presence of an alpha, right? He absolutely does. And a lot of times there's a stubbornness in there. There's a my way or the highway element to it. He'll want a loud voice, I'm sure, and wherever he lands, Pittsburgh, Vegas, I don't see it, but whatever, Minnesota, wherever the other options are, he'll want a large say in how the offense is run, what plays are called, how much sort of freedom he has at the line of scrimmage to change out of something that's called not by him, but by a coach or an offensive coordinator. And so Minnesota is setting a culture in place. It seems to have a solid foundation at ground level. And bringing in Rodgers even for 2 years, it could shake it up a little bit. So I don't have the pulse of, Vikings Nation and the fan base. But I do know for a fact, talking to some of my buddies who are Vikings fans, they're not like, oh my gosh, Minnesota needs to get this done. Holy crap, this would be incredible. They're like, oh yeah, it'd be an option. I think a lot of Viking fans are okay with not bringing back Sam Darnold. And so then you're like, we just went 14-3. Do we turn it over to McCarthy, or do we entertain Rodgers for 2 years, let McCarthy really build up the knowledge? Again, should be 100% healthy for 2025. But last year for McCarthy was probably more rehab-based after 2 knee operations than it was full-fledged diving into the playbook, X's and O's, film, all that stuff. He was doing all that, I guarantee it. But it was more about getting that leg, getting that knee back to 100%. So, again, I'm not saying it's going to happen. I'm not saying there's an overwhelming likelihood that it does. But at surface level, I don't think it can be disputed. Aaron Rodgers to the Vikings makes sense for where they're at and where he's at. So we'll have to see. It is Mitch. I'm on YouTube. Always appreciate all the support. Click the subscribe button. Super easy to do. We'll see you next time.